Our next speaker is Georg Greve. He will talk about living in a free software society.
I'll use this one, it's fine. So good morning, everybody. And welcome back. It feels like I've done this only yesterday. So this is the second talk here, and it's actually the one that I had to think about more. Not necessarily because I'm very unfamiliar with the subject, but because of the way in which I was requested what I was requested to talk about. Let me just briefly find that for you, because essentially Svebora approached me with the simple idea of, I'll find it, trust me. So, your take on the future of free software, its influence on the society and individuals, the public sector roles and importance of companies and hackers, your experience on how to start projects, create jobs, talk to public agencies. Basically, your thoughts inspired by experiences that you accumulated later in life. So, effectively, 42 would be the answer, more or less. The problem really is that, I mean, this subject is so wide that effectively you could probably fill whole conferences with this and make them very interesting. So it felt like, you know, the task given to me was a bit like, you know, give us the how to save the world in 4 minutes or something like that. Well, I can't quite do that, unfortunately, but what I can do is share with you some of the experience that I've made and some of the things that I believe might be valuable to you. Also, knowing a little bit about the local situation and ideally something that will help you and the local communities in the years ahead, and a bit of a, you know, situation overview of where we stand as a community. Just a tiny little, you know, glimpse into the situation I see right now. So where to start? Well, I once swore myself I would never start without this one, because while we all may feel that everyone now knows this, my experience is that very often new people coming to our community do not. And it's also something that we have to keep reiterating and refocusing, because it is sometimes a little bit easy to lose sight of what actually is behind this whole idea of free software. So for those of you who may not know this yet, free software is software that gives you the freedom to use, to study, to share, and to improve. Software that has all these 4 freedoms is free software. Those are freedoms, not obligations, right? Those are rights. You should have all those 4 rights with any software that you use. You don't necessarily have to make use of all of them. Maybe you don't want to use any of them. Maybe you don't want to use that piece of software, or maybe you don't want to modify it. That's all fine. You don't have to do this, but you should be able to. You have that right. Also, I see that this conference nicely makes fun of the big mess of terminology that we have created over the years. So there's always this discussion. What is it? You know, is it free software? Is it open source? Is it libre software? Is it FOSS? Is it FLOSS? Well, people, when they hear different terms, keep looking for different meanings. In this case, that is extremely misleading, because all these things essentially mean the same thing. The licenses that are free software and the licenses that are open source and the licenses that are libre software or FOSS or FLOSS, it's 99.5% the same license base. Those 0.5% are typically human interpretation discussions, and typically not affecting any software that you would normally be in touch with. There's always people who discuss about legal terms, right? The legal community lives on debate, so there's a 0.5 in there. But for all intents and purposes, for all practical means, for all people out there, those are the same things. Which term you use is dependent purely on your own preference. And my preference these days typically is dictated by who it is I am talking to, because I am trying to get across a message, right? So I try to adapt a little bit to what the other side understands or expects in order to pick them up where they are and then lead them along, ideally, a path of knowledge. So make your choice. Personally, I prefer free software because I think it's the freedom that's important, or software freedom is also nice to talk about. But you have your own choice to make, and maybe that choice is even situation dependent. So why is that important? Now, I would trust that there's at least some people in this audience that could give presentations about how free software benefits society in all sorts of ways. Free software, because it gives you the freedom to study, of course, has gigantic educational benefits. There is no excuse for, say, universities not to use and teach free software, because the only way that you can learn how to program is very simply to look at programs and then write programs of your own, make mistakes while you do so, you know, patch dirty and solve your problem. I actually like that presentation. And, you know, get your hands dirty, you know, play with it. If you cannot play with it, if you cannot break it, you cannot learn. So free software is the one model, the one approach to software that allows you to do that, which is why educational benefits should be dramatically obvious. There's a whole range of other issues. There is local economy benefits where, you know, it's possible to build local economic offerings around this, because suddenly everyone, even your local service supplier, has the same right to provide these services. There's whole studies from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the UNCTAD. They've published 2 really big and very good books on how free software has benefited developing economies, how the economic impact of free software dramatically changes the ground rules of that society, and how it gives them a chance to actually catch up to the first world, because they no longer have to pay ridiculous licensing fees to the fat cats. The money stays in the country. It generates local value, local revenue, and local jobs at the end of the day. There's very interesting stories about that, and in fact, I would, if you ever need to talk to politicians, I would recommend to always have those UNCTAD things at hand, because they are really good. They make that point better than you possibly can, because they also come from a very strong background. There are security benefits in free software. I mean, Harald Welte, who spoke yesterday and will speak later again today, he is one of the people who have always been looking into creating transparency in technology, because the only way that we can actually ever have security is through transparency and the ability to adjust. Only if we can fix the bug, it doesn't help us to know that it's there necessarily so much. If we cannot fix it, if we cannot address it, it doesn't really help us all that much. So there is security benefits, but that doesn't mean, of course, that free software is necessarily and inherently and always and totally and utterly secure. And it's software. It's written by human beings. Human beings make mistakes. Sometimes those human beings are maybe junior developers who make more mistakes than some senior developers, and some people are just better than others. So it's not about the fact that it's always automatically necessarily secure, but it's about the fact that we have a much more efficient process at arriving at actual, verifiable, strong security in free software. So there's all sorts of benefits. And I could talk about them, in fact, for a very long time, but I don't want to do that for this presentation. The one thing I want to focus on is something that Lawrence Lessig once coined as code is law. It is the power aspect of code. It is the fact that ultimately this software freedom translates to software self-determination, to software sovereignty. It is sovereign software more than anything else. It's about having control over what you use, what your country uses, what the people around you use, putting everyone in control of their own digital ecosystem. Software is a power issue. It codifies our lives, and that is what Lawrence Lessig has tried to express with that, code is law, which I think still is the best summary of that aspect. It's a matter of who gets to control what you can do. I mean, this all started out with a broken printer driver, right? Where Richard Stallman got really angry that he couldn't fix this thing because someone had arbitrarily limited that function in a way that he could not solve his problem. He was powerless, and it frustrated him. Because he is the person that he is, that frustration he didn't deal with well, so he went on and decided he needed a new operating system. And it had to be free. It's about power. So code is law, but, and this is the first thing that I would like to impart perhaps as a new thing, keep in mind that not all law is code. You see, sometimes in the technological world, we tend to become a little bit blind to what's outside the technology world. That's normal. All human beings have this. It's a completely normal thing to have. But the truth is, there's a whole body of law out there that is not governed by code and that is sometimes stronger than the code. It starts, now that we live in a world of clouds, it starts with things such as terms of services. That is why I cannot often enough plug this project. Terms of service didn't read, because we all know these terms of services are written deliberately to be unreadable. I mean, they are absolutely unparsable to a normal human being. The normal human mind cannot comprehend them. There is a lot of money going into them to make them so. So you don't understand what you are actually signing up to. Terms of services didn't read, aims to fix that. What they do is they provide a very simplified way for you to understand what it is that you are getting yourself into, what you are signing away. You can get this as a browser plugin. It shows up in the little corner, in the URL bar, and then you actually get a little bit of information on this service that I'm right now using. How good is that? Or you just go to their website and get that information there. They have various sites and services up there, and they tell you what is good, what is bad, and why, what that language means. So you don't have to be a lawyer to understand it. I think that is very, very important because, you see, if you give someone the power, if you actually sign away your rights voluntarily, these people will use that power. And there's a whole realm of providers out there these days that ultimately are very, very interested in all of you. I mean, Bruce Schneier has coined this statement that surveillance is the business model of the internet right now. And that is true. You see the largest revenue, the largest valuations, not in companies that work for the people that use their services, but in the companies that somehow treat them a little bit like something that comes into the front end of the sausage maker, not in the back. So be aware of what you are using. And yes, I mean, some of these companies are in fact respected members of the free software community. We've referred to some of their outreach programs. In fact, they're sometimes sponsoring these events even, very often they do. And that is not to belittle their contribution to free software. I mean, they have brilliant technical people. I have very many good friends in some of them. But keep in mind that when you make a decision as a user, and you're always also a user, what you sign away often stays signed away. And you may find yourself in lock-in situations that go beyond the software. I've now seen this multiple times that people said they couldn't switch away from a provider because they had used that identity too often with too many other platforms, sharing too much information with others. It had become too inconvenient for them to leave that service. And of course, governments are no exception to this. Ultimately, governments have always, and yes, this is one of the NSA slides, right? Governments have always tried to gain an advantage. Ideally, they have tried to gain that advantage not for their own personal gain, but for their people. Let's assume that that motivation actually exists in, say, most of the democracies in the world. Plus or minus, politics is difficult, but effectively the fact that governments use the power that they are given in order to try to gain a benefit shouldn't actually have shocked anyone. And that the United States, as the harbor and the legal frame of a lot of these companies to which you have signed away your rights, then use that information. Was that really that much of a surprise? I mean, yes, I know the pervasiveness of it shocked some people. Like the fact that it, you know, was so all-encompassing was shocking. That is all true. But keep in mind, those companies, even if they want to do the very best for you, still live in a legal frame. They live in a country by whose laws they need to abide, and those laws are stronger than the code. And so that is what I mean by not all law is code. We need to keep in mind that sometimes the root of the problem is not in the code. It is in the law or in our pattern of behavior, in our expectations of, and our, desire to get free stuff. Everybody likes free stuff. There's no exceptions almost. I mean, I don't really know any exceptions. So I think everybody likes free stuff. We all do. Free stuff is great. But keep in mind that sometimes it's not free. These problems, we need to solve at the actual root. You can't fix a social problem or a legal problem with technology. That is one of the very hard lessons that we all have to learn. And so we have to understand that we cannot solve this problem in a purely technical way. Yes, technology can help solving this problem, no doubt. We need better technologies because the technologies we built have been compromised. That's all true. I mean, a lot of the technologies we have built that we thought were trustworthy, we found out are not. And that is something we can and must fix. But that is not going to solve the bigger problem. The bigger problem is the question of what political frame do we actually want to live in, because that frame will always determine how that technology is used. And to quote Schneier once more, the internet is a power amplifier. It amplifies power. So yes, if you were powerless before, you have more power now. But if you were powerful before, you are infinitely more powerful afterward. The governments are incredibly powerful players. Us, the tech community, used to ridicule them a little bit for sometimes their somewhat inept approaches at this. Don't. A lot of them have figured this out a whole lot better than we had even begun to imagine. So keep in mind that in the end, that raw power accounts for something. And they have raw power, a lot of it. So that's where we need to fix it, at the policy level, which actually means you, as a technologist, may have to become more political. Sorry about that, but that's unfortunately true. And just a side note, by the way, on motivation, right? So it's always the terrorists, right? No. Sorry, no. Once more, Casper Bowden, former Microsoft staff actually, his presentation, how to wiretap the cloud without almost anybody noticing. Very, very brilliant work. Watch it, it's on YouTube and so on, so watch it. It's entirely watchable, and in fact very worthwhile. Because he also explains how the legislation, in this case in the United States, has explicitly said that that information gathered should be used for the political and economic advantage of the United States, in order to manipulate other governments into policy positions that they would like, as well as benefit their own economy. So I don't buy that they're spending all this money only because they've gone nuts. Because frankly, spending that much money on, on a risk that is actually that small, I mean, humans are bad at risk evaluation. We know that. We've always known this. But spending that much money without an actual economic benefit, I don't know. I don't quite buy it. So I would not be surprised if at some point in the future, eventually we would learn that this was the actual motivation behind it. The political and economic power it buys you. But what does that mean for us as the software freedom community? Well, it actually means that the case for software freedom has never been stronger than today. If anything, they have made our case for us, because before, when we said, look, you need control of the software, you must actually control what software you run, people were kind of going like, yeah, come on, don't be paranoid, how important is this really, and how bad is it really when I install this piece of software where I have no idea what it's doing? Come on, no one could actually ever get that data, and if they could get that data, well, no one has the capacity to actually analyze it. I know many people, including from our own community, who were absolutely certain that, if they would just generate as much data as they wanted and stuff it all down the throat of the NSA, and the NSA would have no way of analyzing that all. I know many people who argued like this. Unfortunately, we now know they were wrong. They have no problem analyzing that data. And, so look at some of this. And it's not like that debate is just new now, right? I mean, read the story by Cory Doctorow about how the US Department of whatever, Homeland Security or Immigrations or whichever it was, outsources its operation to Google. As a fictional story of how they say, well, Google can do this all so much more efficiently, so why don't we let Google do all the border controls? He wrote a story about that 3 years ago, I think, 4, something like this. So it's not like that debate hasn't been had before, but we now have concrete, strong, visible proof of why that point is important. So that is why we as a community actually now have found our case validated in a way it has never been before. We're not using that nearly enough. In fact, the debate right now is spinning around other focal points, which is to some extent understandable, but I think we as a free software community should get better in explaining how free software is one part of that answer. It's not the only answer. Like I said, policy will have to change alongside, but it is part of that answer. And then, of course, we come to the frustration why the better argument does not win. That frustration is very old. We've had that for a while. And this, again, is Lawrence Lessig, right? Who essentially left Creative Commons because he decided, well, we have the better arguments, the other side has none, yet they keep winning. Why is that? Why do we not get a voice in policy if we actually have all the arguments on our side? His answer was, there is a very strong inherent corruption in the US political system in this case that he wants to fix. And in fact, I wish him all the best in the world for that, because frankly, it is in no one's interest, none of ours either, that the US remains in a political system where money can buy influence on that level. I'm not saying the people who have money shouldn't have any influence, but I think they have too much. So I really, really hope that he will succeed with this, although, to be honest, it's a very big task to tackle. He's not really the first one to try it, but he is a good man. So I think he has a shot at this, and so far, from what I see, is actually there is some take-up on this, and people are starting to ask some questions which are good. But there's also what I call the third law of politics, based on this. I'm sure you all know it. This old thing about, you know, a sufficiently advanced form of technology is indistinguishable from magic. In a sufficiently advanced form of corruption is also indistinguishable from incompetence, but incompetence still exists. Don't underestimate the actual genuine lack of understanding in a person you are talking to on the other side for what you are talking about. It is very easy sometimes to say, this guy's corrupt, right? Or this woman is just, come on, really? And sometimes that's true. I'm sorry, sometimes that is true. But don't jump to that conclusion too quickly, because sometimes they are genuinely just confused. And we know that the proprietary side is employing very efficient people at confusing. They are really, really good at this. They have trained those tricks for 25, 30 years now. They are really good at it. Don't underestimate them. They are smart, they are funny, they are well educated, and they can make their points, no matter how ludicrous they may seem, with such utter conviction that just that conviction carries across to someone who does not know the matter well enough, and they think, okay, if this guy is so convinced, he's such a nice guy, there must be some truth in what he says. And then often people will say, well, the other guy's also nice, he's saying the exact opposite, but he also seems very convinced, so maybe the truth is in the middle. It's a very human reaction to when you don't know better. Take that into account. It takes constant and repeating, sometimes repetitive even, education and talking to people about these issues in order to make them understand. And yes, we should expose corruption and it should be rooted out, because frankly it's an evil. It preys on all of us, but don't think that every politician that makes a bad call is corrupt. They're not. Not all of them. Some of them are genuinely well motivated. They really don't understand what this is about. And they are supposed to discuss 10 areas with competency, right? Today they do IT, tomorrow they do agricultural policy, next day at, labor rights. And somehow they're supposed to pay proper respect to all of them and make smart decisions in all of them. It's not that easy. And then public sector often struggles with finding good people. That's the other problem. A lot of the best people are snatched up by industry, including myself. So, I'm guilty of this as well, right? Everyone wants the best people. Industry often has the better arguments in finding them and giving them more flexible, more fun, and better paid environments. So who can blame them for wanting that environment? I can't really. But it also means very often you need to help the people who still try to do their best in public sector and help them understand the parts that they don't maybe get right now and be patient with them, because they are actually trying to do their best. My basic assumption for dealing with virtually all of them is always they try to do the best they can. In a highly politicized, often difficult environment, they really try. They really do. It's just not that easy sometimes, and sometimes it's stupid office floor politics that decide what gets done. Then, I know we all like to work on fun technology. That's all cool. And I invite you to keep doing that. That's fantastic. Go play with stuff. Great. Solve your own itch. Scratch it as hard as you can. But keep in mind that perhaps the itch you feel is not necessarily the itch that everyone else is feeling. And if you want your software to be used by millions and millions and perhaps even billions of people one day, ask yourself about who is this really relevant for, and how can I make it more relevant for them? This is a very thoroughly unsexy thing to do, I know. A lot of us like to look at the corner cases and explore the interesting avenues. And it's a daily grind of dealing with the small and nitty-gritty. And the LibreOffice community has to deal with this as well, right? It's not like, you know, a word processor or a spreadsheet is like the most exciting thing in the world. They have made it fun for their community. And I really credit them a lot for that. Other communities need to do the same. We need to build the tools that solve the actual problems for the actual people if we want them to use it, and do it in a way that is friendly to them. So usability is one of the things that a lot of us need to pay a lot more attention to, because frankly, very few software developers that I have seen are good at usability. Very few. There is exceptions to that rule, but most certainly, or in most cases, if you're a software developer, your usability ideas will perhaps not work so well. And what is perfectly fine for you isn't really all that intuitive and fun to use for someone else. So ask yourself, what are the actual needs, and then solve the actual problem. That is something else. I mean, also in the wake now of the entire NSA thing, and there's now all sorts of ideas of, you know, building all these various messaging systems and, you know, creating new versions of email and all this kind of stuff, right? Great, fantastic. Only that, who's going to use this, really? I mean, who is actually going to use that new protocol? Will you be able to get adoption of that protocol across all the services, across all the software that is already deployed out there? Don't underestimate the networking effects. The problem is, networking effects are ridiculously strong. I mean, I know organizations that still use the Internet Explorer 6. Not because they think it's a great idea, but because the networking effects have kept them in situations where they had no way to turn this thing off. So do not underestimate the speed at which some things can move. Keep the networking effects in mind. Reinventing critical parts of infrastructure is all great, as long as you can keep it backward compatible in a way that you can still interact with all the stuff that is out there. And the question is that incremental gain that you are having in mind over whatever's out there, is that big enough to overcome that legacy of networking effects? And unfortunately, for a lot of the projects that I see out there, I'm pretty sure it's not, especially once you start looking at the corporate adoption of some of this, which would have to follow. Otherwise, you know, if the companies are not using it, not only do you stand out way more in the data stream, but the adoption is always going to remain small. You're going to use the one telephone system that is incompatible to everyone else in the world. So you can call your 5 buddies, but no one else. That's not all that appealing. Try to be smart about where you invest your brain power. I mean, I'm now an old guy, so you know, you have a limited amount of time to write code. Try to make it count. I mean, tackle the interesting problems, yes, but keep in mind that at the end of the day, if you want your work to mean something, do something that is meaningful to the people. And ultimately, you know, freedom alone is not enough. There is certain parts in our community who think, oh, people should buy this because it's free software, right? It may suck, it may only do 10% of what the proprietary alternative does, but they should still buy it. And they should pay me twice as much as they do for the proprietary because, you know, it's free, it's awesome. While there is some logic in that, unfortunately that is not how the world works in my experience. The market does not owe you anything. Well, actually it does, but it doesn't realize it, so it's worth nothing for you. Yes, in principle, every free software developer should get perhaps even a very nice basic, solid income, unconditional per month, so they can focus on free software development and make the world a better place. I would love that. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, to be honest. So we will have to find other ways of enabling people to work on free software. And for that, we need to understand the market needs to buy what we create. And that means we need to understand that freedom is one puzzle stone, often not the most important, in getting your software adopted. My own experience, the freedom aspect is perhaps 2 to 5% of the decision. Sometimes more, but very often is that low. Freedom alone does not sell it. It's great and it's important and you should keep doing it, but it's not the one thing that will make everyone come and buy from you. Then, for the entrepreneurs, it'll be blood, sweat, and tears. Trust me, I've been there. A company is a company. Doing a free software business is no easier than doing any other business. And a lot of businesses fail. It is very hard to build up a good business. And it's very often not the code that fails. You can see plenty of examples, even very large examples with crappy software, who gotten very successful commercially, despite having very crappy software. And there is excellent software that has unfortunately never made it really big. So it is, unfortunately, I am afraid to give you that bad news, but it is not the code that fails. You should write good code because I believe quality will win if you do the business part right, but it's not only the code. A company must work as a business. And if you do this right, you can then be in the favorable position to pay free software developers to create more free software for society. And I wish you all the best of luck in doing that. And in fact, I'm happy to talk to anyone who wants to do this and share my experiences, because this is a long book, so I'm not going to go into that. But be aware that everything worthwhile, generally in life, is more work. It takes longer than you thought. Companies are no exception to this. If you want to start up a business, it is a lot of work. I don't mean to dissuade anyone. It's also great fun. Personally, I love being an entrepreneur. I've done this in the non-profit world first, and now I'm doing it in the for-profit world. And I've worked crazy hours, but frankly, I really like it. I love what I do. And waking up in the morning feeling that you love what you do, I think is a great gift. And you can have that gift too, but don't underestimate the moments when you wake up at night and you wonder how this thing is going to work out at all. Those are going to come. It takes a lot of work. And now to the market. I mean, that also includes you, because you all make purchasing decisions, but these are my words to the market up there. I hope it's listening. You desperately want to pay for free software. You do not want free software for free. Because actually my grandmother had this thing that, she couldn't afford to buy cheap because she didn't have a lot of money. It's a little bit like that. There is a question about smart versus dumb money in this. Yes, you can perhaps skip by now by somehow fiddling and diddling and making it work for yourself, and that's all fine and dandy. But very often, and I've seen this more often than I care to remember, people work themselves in a corner doing that. They create a fork of whatever they're using. They do not actually interact with the community at all because they don't have any capacity or budget planned in for this. They don't also hire anyone who knows what they're doing. So they just keep, yeah, you've seen this too, right? So they just kind of go like, oh, it's awesome, it's free, and they start using it and build processes around it, and this thing grows in this humongous monster, which no one can maintain anymore, has dozens of unpatched security holes because they cannot get the upstream fixes for the security issues, and it's just a gigantic liability. Horrible. And then what they very often do, unfortunately, is they have one of the big integrators, consultancy companies come in and solve the problem for them, which typically means they get rolled back to some proprietary solution. And they pay about 10 times as much as it would have cost them if they had done this right from the start for that emergency fixing, or when the actual security issue hits them. So not paying for free software is a really dumb idea. It looks like it's going to save you money right now, but it is really just essentially building up a liability that one day will come to bite you in the ass. Seriously, you do want to pay for free software. You want to set aside a proper budget, and that budget should ideally be in the same order of magnitude as you would for any other software project. Because the benefits you're getting out of this are going to be really strong in the medium to long term, for sure. Maybe you have some short-term gains as well. But don't be so dumb to think that you can actually get away without paying anything. Everything on this planet has a price, even death. Everything. Software is no different, and free software is also no different. So be smart about spending your money and pay for free software. I'm not saying you should be, just throwing your money out of the window for whatever unclear purposes, but do this properly. Do this well. All the technical aspects, all the project management aspects, all the ways about how to properly run software projects, all of these things are true for free software as well. So is the want and the need, in fact, for an ecosystem that can supply you with the various security updates, functional updates, and so on and so forth. If you're smart about this, you foster an ecosystem. I have seen people who are now also coming to me nicely. I mean, I like that. But I've seen companies who've learned that lesson the hard way. They have used a solution that was fully free software. They have just kind of, thrown it out there on their own without any upstream connection. They have not paid any of the developers anything for any of this. And what happened is the developers eventually, at some point when they couldn't make a living and they maybe had a family, maybe had children, right, had to do something else. Although they would have preferred to keep working on this, they had to do something else to feed their family. And so that project died. So then they find themselves in a situation where they are running on a deprecated solution with no upgrades, no upgrade path anywhere, and they need to somehow get out of there. When on the other side, by just planning some money in for actually keeping that ecosystem alive and helping it, fostering it, not much, just some. If everyone uses that software and everyone just contributes some, there's a very, very strong basis to stand on. Then they could have gotten tons of new features, tons of updates, all this stuff basically for free, for a way more effective cost than otherwise would have been possible. The economies are clearly on the side of free software because the efficiency gain you get through this is so much better. So with less money, you can actually reach much more. But don't think that you can actually somehow drain that ecosystem and then still find it when you need it a year later. You need to foster the ecosystem. And that is true, by the way, also for local governments. Local governments need to understand that if they want a flourishing software industry locally, they need to help foster that ecosystem, and also through their own purchasing power, by the way. Purchasing power of government is anywhere between 30 to 60% per country, depends. But somewhere in that realm. It's a very, very big chunk of the market. And it controls where a lot of the market is heading. So as a local government, I have the chance to either foster or kill my local ecosystem of software companies. So I can actually either create an environment where the university degrees get cranked out, all the people actually have jobs because they can serve the local economy and create local value, or not. It's my choice. But then I throw away part of the investment that I'm making on the universities, which is also really dumb money. So keep that in mind. And if you are still a student, perhaps, or wondering what to do with your life, join the winning team, because despite all the difficulties and intricacies, free software is winning. Even the proprietary world could no longer live without free software. It is very funny, but it's also true. And there is no large proprietary company that does not have some level of adoption of free software, or even depends on it crucially for some of its infrastructure or some of its product. This is a picture from Prague, actually, I think 2 years ago, at the OpenSUSE conference, OpenSUSE being one of the many wonderful communities in this larger free software community. Great fun to be there, great fun to be with these people. And so it's not only the right thing and the winning team, but it's also fantastic fun to be with these people. Because without fail, the free software community is one of the most interesting places to spend both your personal and professional career. At least, well, I believe so, but then I might be biased. So anyway, get involved. And don't lose heart. I know this is a hellish, huge job for anyone, right? I mean, all of these things. There's so much to do. There's so few of us sometimes, it seems. So it's a hellish job for any one person. But you are not alone. We are a community, and we are growing. We have been growing for a long time, and we keep growing. Both by our own, young members who grow in, as well as side influences. So you're not alone. Thank you.
Any questions or comments?
You mentioned a book for politicians. I didn't catch the name or body of books.
Yeah, that's the United Nations for Conference Trade and the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, the UNCTAD. Look for the UNCTAD software report. They've published the last two I've seen were heavily based on free software. So very big, this thick stacks of paper. So.
Well, migrations to free and open source software are always fairly social, and we all know that, and it's all from the psychological perspective. It's very difficult to go there, and I would like to hear you what approach people should actually take when they are talking with politicians in order to migrate to free and open source software.
Yes, migrations are always complex and difficult, and sometimes they fail. We've all heard about the cases where that's the case, but there's also success stories, right? There's a bunch of things. First of all, keep in mind that migrations between proprietary software solutions fail at least as often. I've never seen statistics on how often that's actually the case, but I've seen many failed projects in that realm as well. So, not always is failure necessarily to be attributed against what you migrate to. Very often it's also what you migrate from. The question of how deep you have embedded yourself structurally, locked yourself into a proprietary solution. That, in my experience, gets underestimated. And then you have all the classical failings of project management to begin with, right? Project management is hard. Good project managers are also rare to find, so sometimes it's actually just bad project management. It has nothing to do with the software, whether free or proprietary. It doesn't actually matter in that case. So, first thing to look out for is try to plan this thing well. Focus, I mean, I know we all look at the technology first and foremost, but don't underestimate the project management side of this. Plan that well and spend a little bit more time on that if you at all can, because my experience is that is where most of the failure is generated, not in technology. Because free software, for the very largest part, can do technically virtually everything that's there, but you know, it is there, and then you could use it, but if the project management lets it down, it never gets to show what it can actually do. It's one thing. The other thing is keep the users in mind. The migrations that were successful and the success of the migration afterward are often assessed by the user acceptance, and rightly so. I mean, the users are the ones who have to live with this then every single day of their work life after the migration, right, if there's a bigger institution. So keep in mind that it's actually about the users. So keep them involved, draw them with you, and make sure you plan in your project migration also for exactly the user perception, adoption, plan some time in for making sure that whatever user stories they have that they feel are not correctly addressed, you have ways of mitigating that. Because, I mean, we have the huge advantage as a free software community that we are way more flexible than the proprietary vendors, much more. It's a gigantic advantage. We don't use that near enough sometimes. But we can only be flexible if we know what we need to do, right? If we don't know what to do, it doesn't help us to be flexible. So make sure that you plan enough user acceptance aspects into any project that you're doing. And then, of course, you know, the third is always all the migration aspects on the technical side, where try to pick a path where ideally you can replace one component after another. Starting with the easier ones that are further away from the users is often a good idea, but not always, strangely enough. There is some counterexample to that, so it's very individual to organization, which means you might have to look at this on a case-to-case basis in terms of what is my migration strategy here. So there is no silver bullet for this. But my experience, starting with what you can control easier and more centrally from your IT department is a good idea. Sometimes maybe you should invest first into some central software management or stuff like that, because then you actually have the ability to deploy and deploy fast and also update fast in case you need to react. Give yourself that capability first, perhaps, because then you don't have to somehow try to retrofit it after you already have the problem. Because it is much, much harder to be running after a failed project than to do it right from the start. It's way more difficult to put that project back on rails after it has derailed. So I think those are the areas where we should really look, and perhaps something like, you know, having some early adopters in the organization who then become evangelists for the new solutions, stuff like that. The city of Munich has done some very smart things about how they approach that, in that they said the new hardware you only get with the new stack, with the new software. So people who wanted the newer machine had to go for the new solution, but it was their choice. It put them a little bit in control as to when they deployed that. These kinds of mechanisms, built them in there, because the technology is rarely ever the big showstopper.
Thank you.
You said that we have to pay developers, open source developers, but my experience is a little bit bad on this side. When I was searching for code review for our kernel patches, I approached most of the developers on the kernel mailing list, and all of them have very good jobs. they don't have spare time for me, even though I wanted to pay. So actually, what I did was I found code review within my circles, my friends, which are also open source developers. But I see as a company that this is a problem, that as a company I want to get a review of these guys, I want to hire them to write something for me, and it's almost impossible to hire a good open source guy. So at the end, usually companies go to other companies that are not very well suited for open source development, and the result is even crappier software. What's your comment on that?
Well, there's two comments. One is the Linux kernel certainly is very special, because very few pieces of our entire ecosystem receive as much support and as much funding, right? Yeah. So it is a very special case, and to some extent a red herring, because I know very few communities struggle with that problem particularly. Secondly, what you are describing is effectively a lack of offering more than a lack of willingness on your behalf of paying, which to me is great news, because it means that the ecosystem is growing, right? That's what you would be looking for in a growing economy, is that the demand that the supply cannot match the demand. So that per se doesn't sound like such bad news in general, even though I agree that in this particular case it's a problem. Very often my experience is that it's still the other way around. It's much harder to convince especially the not technical companies to understand how important it is to actually keep paying for this. That is more often the problem I find. But in this particular case, yes, I agree, it would be very good if we had more companies in and around some projects, and maybe the Linux kernel is one of them, where you can get that kind of service. And perhaps there's a business model in this that hasn't actually been valued yet, because it doesn't exist in other ecosystems. Maybe the free software ecosystem needs a new business model along the lines of code peer review by senior programmers who can be paid to actually look at what you have created so you can upstream it properly. A lot of the larger companies that offer these kinds of services have in-house this, right? Red Hat does this in-house ultimately, so do some others. I'm not sure whether you have tried to work with Red Hat, for instance, on this, because they have the in-house competency to do it. But yes, maybe there is an actual business model there.
Just on that last note, maybe with lacking developers, and I'm not really sure that open source people want to solve other people's problem. I think that is inherent thing with open source, and all that talk about we needing to spread the word and go into government and go maybe into industry and so on. I'm not really sure that's the right thing to do. And I'm not really sure that that is coming from real open source developers and technologists. More and more I'm starting to see all that talk like just some another sale talk about open source. Do you think maybe you have some comment on that, or do you agree or disagree?
Well, I think I would disagree. So my experience is that 80 to 90% of the code in free software these days is written for profit, so by people who actually get paid for doing this. The people who work on it as l'art pour l'art, essentially, so the pure, art for the art's sake, is ridiculously small. They exist, but it's an extremely small minority. And I mean, you have to be able to afford doing that to begin with, right? Unless you're either living as an impoverished monk, which some typically prefer, to be honest.
I would just like to add a comment on this by helping others. That's actually in most cases what I had a chance to notice, and I went through that helping others and making the world better actually happens later on, because most of us actually start with free and open source technology by just as a user from the technical perspective. And then later on you actually figure out that behind all that there is a community and there is a world that actually develops it and lives by those standards.
Yep, I agree with that. I mean, my personal way into this was also, I loved the technology because of the technology. I found it interesting, fascinating, I fiddled with it. I started developing software and eventually started to realize there was a bigger thing here. Because at that time, actually, I was in contact with Richard Stallman for one of the softwares that I had written to enter the GNU project. And so, you know, I started reading the philosophy section, and you know, this is how I came into this. It's not like I woke up, you know, one morning when I was 3 years old and said, I'm going to save the world now and I'm going to go through free software. That's not how it happens. You know, you have a technical inclination first, typically. But then you understand that what you do in free software and what you do in technology changes on a small scale, sometimes also on a big scale, but changes to some extent the way this world works, and you can make a choice as to what change you want to be in the world, just as you can in any other profession. It's just that software is more powerful than many other professions.
Any more questions or comments?
Thank you.
No? Thank you very much.